Ever wonder how the Amish thrive without modern grocery stores? Their secret lies in forgotten pantry staples, foods that last, nourish, and never go to waste. While most people have moved on, these 25 essentials have stood the test of time. So, what are they, and why should you stock up too? Pear butter is something that Amish people would use almost religiously, really, but traditional Amish pear butter was always made with an incredible attention to detail. With this one, you basically had pears that had to have been slowly simmered for hours, oftentimes with a lot of warm spices. They'd throw in cinnamon, nutmeg, and God knows what else in there, and do that for hours until it would basically mesh into this really refined, thickened, smooth, caramelized spread. This wasn't like apple butter, and the sweetness of pear butter was extremely delicate and subtle, but it was a perfect spread. It was a great way to spice up your toast, to top off your pastries, or just something to dip your biscuits in. Also, despite the misleading name, this is yet another case of how the name isn't something that shows you what the food really is. Pear butter actually does not have any butter, they just call it that because it feels like it. I mean, hey, as long as it works, right? Did you know that most Amish families used to make these in really large copper kettles over open fires? It's amazing. Pickled red beets are something that are a must-have side dish for most Amish families and their dinner time. And it's always something you see being served with American classics like roast chicken, pot roast, or some ham. Beets were always grown in most gardens that Amish families had, since relying on agricultural practices to help sustain supplies was a common thing for them. Amish versions of these pickled beets tend to be a lot sweeter than the grocery store Oversian, which I'm not really sure why, except of course that delectable brine they make. Throw some vinegar, sugar, cinnamon, cloves, and allspice in, and you have yourself an incredible kind of broth and brine. Eggs would typically be pickled in the brine along with it, and one of the most popular things to do was to basically just take these hard-boiled eggs where the beet brine that's left over is used for soaking them. Then they get this really aesthetic pink color and a taste you can't miss anywhere, so now your food can be just as pretty as you. So throw out the Crisco and the Wesson bottles because I'm about to show you what the original cooking fat used to be. See, back in the days of your great-grandparents and the typical setting of the Red Dead series, you could pretty much expect everyone to be carrying around some beef tallow, especially if you were living in Amish households or visiting them regularly. In rural areas, whenever cattle would be slaughtered, it would be an unspoken rule to ensure that every part of the cow that was butchered would be used. This included all the internal organs, but it also meant the protective layers of fat around those organs. Also, beef tallow used to be something people USD when they didn't even have kerosene lamps and gas lighting, so they would make tallow candles from scratch and use that for light. A lot of themes wore that it really does something extra for a pie crust too, apparently. It makes them extra crispy and flaky. Not just that, Amish families also thoroughly relied on beef tallow for making soap, so they definitely knew their way around a can of this stuff. So, home-canned venison wasn't just something that Amish people would use for food. For Amish families and also for a lot of rural homesteaders, home-canned venison was a very important way of preservation. It was something they relied on to store wild game meat as a lot of them didn't have access to refrigeration, and many Amish communities didn't use electricity. Canned venison was a way for them to keep meat shelf stable not just for an extended amount of time but for months and years. Pressure canning was also really helpful because meat just wasn't like fruits and vegetables. You had to pressure the stuff so that it would kill all the harmful bacteria swimming around that was definitely looking to kill you. Plus, canned venison wasn't just something you didn't need refrigeration for. It was also something you didn't need a freezer for. Lots of Amish families also preferred the canned variants over the frozen ones because they believed you got a really rich flavor right out of the jar thanks to it being condensed for so long. It really took all of its time to absorb all the seasonings, you know? Corn cob jelly is a pretty pioneer recipe. It's something that originated in Amish kitchens where, again, the idea was to avoid wastage as much as you could, right? That didn't just mean the animal and living things you slaughtered to eat. It also meant that after you took out the kernels from the sweet corn, you wouldn't leave the cobs alone. No, those were boiled so that the natural sugar and flavors that were in them could be extracted. And that would pretty much make this really exquisite honey-like jelly, and the color of this would switch up too. So if you were using your typical yellow corn cob, then you would get this really overly golden and honey-looking jelly, but if you used red corn cobs, then you would get a red or pink-hued jelly that was really similar to strawberry jam. Funnily enough, despite being made from corn cobs, a lot of people often said that it just felt like it tasted like honey or apple jelly. This did mean that it was an incredible, free, and natural alternative to honey when it would be too expensive, or when budgets were tight. Hey, it's still something you can find in local Amish markets and roadside farm stands, so it's not completely forgotten, but it's not even 25% as widespread as it used to be. Pickled eggs were an Amish deli favorite and have had pretty strong cultural connections and roots for a while, particularly to Amish country kitchens and rural American bars. They were the kind of thing you would keep on your shelf in those obscenely large jars or bar tops, and they were also a wonderful way to deal with a problem you'd love to be having. Too many eggs? Yup. Amish families were most often farm families, and let's just say hens have an incredibly productive schedule when it comes to egg production. The Amish communities in the area therefore came up with a number of different ways to deal with eggs, pickled ones being the best and most popular. But hey, they didn't only know how to work with beet brine. Amish families had pickled eggs in spicy garlic brines, sweet and sour vinegar brines, and bread and butter pickles. They were pickled eggs that had been served alongside all kinds of sandwiches or fried chicken or ham. It was just a really easy and quick snack to grab on your way to work or as you were picking your kid up from school. Goose grease was something that people called poor man's butter, but before Crisco could save the day or margarine became a staple name on everyone's tongue tips, goose grease, like beef tallow, was a common sight in most Amish kitchens and rural kitchens. It was used exactly the way you would use butter or lard. You'd use it to fry, to roast, or just to spread on toast, and make it a bit more exciting and interesting than it would otherwise be. Plus, you get grease anyway. It's like when you take a car apart and you get nuts, bolts. Okay? This analogy isn't going anywhere, but you know what did go somewhere? Goose grease. It wasn't just something people used as a cheap substitute for butter, it was also something they used a traditional folk remedy. They would rub it on the chest whenever people had congestion issues, just the way people use Vicks balm today. Amish grandmothers would die on hills swearing how this works better than any of the fancy manufactured crap you can buy in stores, and maybe they really were onto something. Either way, I'll make sure to verify the next time I have some goose grease handy on me. Shoofly pie filling was really something that showed you the sheer potential molasses had. This was a filling that was entirely made from a lot of molasses, brown sugar, butter, flour, and some eggs, only to make this really gooey, rich filling that had a sweet flavor but also a slight taste. So you had a wet bottom Shoofly pie which was really soft, right? It was like that typical custard eye molasses texture you're super used to. It also settles right at the bottom, and the dry bottom Shoofly pie was something that had a cake-like consistency. It was first something people often enjoyed as this coffee cake substitute, but it was also something people loved thanks to how sticky and sweet it was. I know that seems like a bit of a weird thing to say, but textures don't make sense to me either. Neither does the name Shoofly, which apparently came from the fact that even flies were deeply attracted to the scent of sweet molasses being carried for miles and miles as the pies would cool on farmhouse windowsills or next to windmills. Dried soup beans were a big staple for winters, and Amish families pretty much relied on dried beans being stored in bulk levels to last throughout the winter. They were really economical, super filling, and they lasted an entirety if you knew how to take care of them. Of course, the Amish were experts in that. They were also just really common in most Amish one-pot meals like thick soups and stews, but they had a bit of a preference for beans. It seems most communities didn't really step outside the usual routine of navy beans, pinto and lima beans, and great northern beans. The pinto beans were honestly just there because some Amish-Mexican hybrid food would slap harder than it had any right to. Ham and bean soup, which great northern beans were pretty much typically used for, was used in one of the most classic Amish meals. Ham and bean soup was made by simmering lots of navy beans with ham hocks, and it was delicious. I mean, it was really punching above its weight. You know how I keep mentioning that people back then had a real deep-seated mentality of not letting a singular thing go to waste? Well, Scrapple was something that was made by German settlers and Pennsylvania Dutch families. It was something they relied on so that every possible part of the pig would be used up and consumed, because that was just free nutrition you were leaving up on the table. Hey, nothing was excluded. Sure, you might be going for some unfamiliar names like the liver, the heart, the head meat, scraps, etc., but people wouldn't even leave the eyes and brains. Not sure if I entirely disagree with that, but I definitely see the benefit. Anyway, Scrapple is something that you slice and fry in a really hot pan until you get that to die for texture on the outside. You know that crunch that fixes you? That's what we fry things for. A Pennsylvania Dutch breakfast staple was literally just homemade or leftover Scrapple, and this was one of the most popular things in not just a lot of different Amish communities, but a lot of regional communities throughout Virginia, Delaware, and Maryland. Dried dandelion greens were one of the most readily available sources of vitamins in Amish communities, especially rural ones. People wouldn't really rely on buying store-bought greens. Instead, Amish families had long-held cultural practices surrounding foraging. They would forage for dandelions mostly in spring and summer, and I don't know about you, but that's some real cottagecore stuff to me. Why don't my friends ever message me for a Wednesday 9 a.m. berry and dandelion picking plan? If you're the friend in the group considering this, at least shoot a text so I can live vicariously through you. Oh, but it'll be worth your while too. Dandelion greens aren't just good to the taste, but they feel a lot like spinach too. They're also extremely good for your skin, mixed with other wild greens that make an incredible salad. They work as a detox if you can mix them into a tonic, and Amish communities would essentially ground them into this coffee-like beverage that would help a lot with stomach issues. Sorghum syrup was, and I really need to stress this, not the same thing as molasses. I mean, sure, maybe people threw in some molasses there, typically blackstrap ones, but sorghum syrup was something that just came from sorghum cane and not sugar cane. It had a much fruitier and lighter texture, and it was also sour, had molasses, and had a lot of benefits to your skin just like dandelions do. But see, making sorghum syrup really wasn't easy. In fact, a lot of people regarded it as this massive community effort. In Amish farm communities or southern communities, it was a big practice for families to get together, make an entire day out of it, and begin harvesting the tall sorghum stalks. They would run those bad boys through a horse or a mule-powered press just to get some of that good juice out, and that juice was then boiled down for literally hours. Imagine the scent. It was boiled just so it would thicken into a really rich syrup, and by now you might have noticed that a lot of Amish recipes rely on boiling and reducing things to syrups and jellies, and I think I'm really vibing with that. I mean, everyone can make a meatloaf, but how many people do you know that can whip up 5 different types of syrups and jellies on a whim? Dried apples were essentially just this massive staple of Amish people. It was how they worked with apples before refrigeration became a nationwide thing you could never escape. I guess nationwide is the wrong term. Almost everyone has refrigerators nowadays. You ever want those 2-door ones? I'm getting off topic. Actually, I'm not. You wouldn't even need those 2-door ones if you knew how to dry apples. See, Amish people would essentially just string up apple slices onto thread and hang them across rafters so that they would dry naturally. And this basically allowed an incredible amount of air circulation. Now, I know your immediate first question is going to be, what about the bugs? Who's keeping them away? Wouldn't they pile up all over the slices? And the answer to your question is no. The air circulation also helps to keep those bugs away. Dried apples were completely harmless, safe, and a great natural way of preserving apples. Otherwise, so many people in Amish and Pennsylvania Dutch communities wouldn't have been relying on them and making schnitz pies and dumplings out of them. Home-canned chicken was also a way for people to begin to basically store things without the need for refrigeration. It was really typical of most families to do this, and it was essentially the exact same deal as home-canned venison. You had to pressure can it too, and Amish families would actually have these big stovetop pressure canners to ensure that they were being safely preserved. It would be a big cause for concern and hysteria if your chicken or meat went foul, you know? Even worse if it was because of some stupid mistake that could have been easily avoided. Home-canned chicken was something that was typically packed into quart-sized mason jars, and then it was caned on butchering day. That was a special event because, see, since Amish families we're so accustomed to growing their own chickens and raising them, oftentimes on butchering day they would mass process and can birds at once, and this would go up to dozens of birds by hand. I mean, I love my casseroles and chicken pot pie, but hey, that's a lot, isn't it? Home fermented sauerkraut was something that was essentially just Amish and Pennsylvania Dutch communities came up with. I mean, no, not sauerkraut itself. That was a German tradition through and through. Please put the guns down, guys. Homemade sauerkraut was a German and Swiss tradition, yes, but when they came over here, they obviously brought that part of their lives with them. Instead of using modern jars, Amish families would typically ferment cabbage in these stoneware crocks or large ceramic pots, and sometimes these things would cross over 20 pounds, so like really, it was heavy. The cabbage that they would ferment in these, and it wasn't necessary for it to just be cabbage or sauerkraut all the time, they fermented a lot, but anyway, the cabbage was something that they would leave to ferment for around 4 to 6 weeks. At the end of it, families ate sauerkraut with pork on New Year's, and they also believed that it would help bring a lot of prosperity and good fortune to the years that were coming. I mean, hey, if that's true, I know what I should have on December 31st, 2024, because by God, the year is already looking toasty. Have you seen the heat in just February? Canned mincemeat used to contain ground beef, venison, or even beef fat, and it would be mixed in with apples, raisins, and different kinds of spices, and this was a version of it that was really different to your typical idea and understanding of canned meat. So you'd normally not even think of the idea of fruit being in there too, right? The spices, fine, understandable, helps create that good old flavor you're paying top dollar for, but what about the rest? Who wants notes of apple and citrus as they go in for another spoonful of ground beef? Canned mincemeat was something that became a holiday staple, and it was a Thanksgiving and Christmas pie classic. It was something they would throw in different kinds of pastries, sandwiches, desserts, and potluck recipes, and it was really just a festive ingredient. It had something for everyone, and Amish families would especially make use of it for the fact that it could be stored so long and add so much flavor to whatever you were working with. As far as what flavors you could expect with this one, it was literally just chopped apples, raisins, different currants, cinnamon, spice, sorghum syrup, and sometimes, just sometimes, a little bit of brandy on the side for preservation, if you know what I mean. Maybe you're tired of the typical available options for glucose. Maybe you've had your fill of brown sugar, and maybe you don't really want that sugar-free diet alternative they sell in stores for everything either. A very nice Amish alternative to typical options for sugar was essentially just beet sugar. Amish and rural Midwestern families almost entirely depended on beet sugar, in fact. From locally grown sugar beets instead of imported sugarcane, they really showcased how the land could give you everything you needed if you knew how to cultivate it. It was something that became extremely popular in Amish farming communities, and sugar beet farming has a long history in tastes like Minnesota, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Ohio. Most descendants of those farmers live there now too, and they do still keep local refineries stocked and loaded with sugar beets. What's the difference though? Well, to be honest, there really isn't much. Beet sugar is nearly identical to cane sugar, and you could make essentially every last thing you were used to making with normal sugar with this. You could bake your cakes, do your elaborate cookie designs, pies, sweetened preserves, and jams, and have all kinds of homemade candy. If anything, you might notice a slight aftertaste that's different from your usual sugar, but it's not anything that really disturbs the vibe of the meal. In fact, most Amish families preferred these over molasses, especially for sweetening apple butter and coffee. If you want to talk about winter favorites, then the Amish really know how to make the best use out of fruits, as you can probably already tell from the vast majority of the content on this video. See, this time around we're going to talk about another tradition that they enriched with their fruity knowledge, apple schnitz, which essentially comes from the German word schnitzen, which basically just means to slice. It refers to these super lean, sliced and dried apples that were a massive ingredient in Amish pies, dumplings, and stews, and yes, they would air dry these too. They would dry them on racks or near wood stoves or, like I said, on rafters. The traditional Amish schnitz pie was one of the most notorious recipes to ever come out of the Pennsylvania Dutch region, and it was made by stewing dried apples together with just a generous bit of sugar and cinnamon. Then, you would simply boil it for a really soft filling that honestly was a lot like jam. And voila, you now had a delicious spread that could be used for literally anything, from pies, tarts, and pudding to toasts, dumplings, ham, and soaked meats. Apple schnitz was actually something Amish people frequently cooked alongside ham, meaning that it was one of their most well-received sweet and savory dishes. Plus, even at lots of Amish churches, right? You would see a lot of people serving and eating apple schnitz, and it would typically be given to refugees or destitute individuals eating this to just get some food in their bellies. Cracklings just happen to be the crispy bits of pork, the ones that are just a little bit browned. These ones would be left over after the lard was done rendering, and they were just a byproduct of the entire process. But as you know, Amish families are pretty strict about the no-wasting thing. In the South and Midwest, butchered hogs were considered a precious resource, and during hog butchering season, which typically persisted from late fall to the earliest of winter, Amish and farm families would render lots of lard in these large kettles over an open fire. The leftover crispy bits of pieces were cracklings, and they became an incredibly high-value meal for a lot of different reasons. I mean, besides it just being flat-out delicious, it was stupidly nutritious, It went really well with cornmeal too, and you could even make crackling cornbread if you threw this into the cornmeal batter before getting to baking. Modern pork rinds, which are now known as chicharrones, were made by deep-frying this same pork skin, but traditional cracklings from back then were a lot meatier. They had actual connective tissue, so they were definitely a lot easier to chew through. Amish cooks used to save cracklings in crocks and tins and basically work them as a flavor enhancer, and I think it worked pretty well. See, homemade Amish ketchup is a lot more than just the store-bought ketchup you might be picturing in your mind right now. Unlike the store-bought variant, Amish recipes don't actually always involve a lot of tomatoes, and sometimes they don't even involve any tomatoes. Yep, the Amish community is well known for being able to make a handful out of nothing, and they can definitely whip up enough different kinds of ketchups to give their jelly cabinet a run for its money. Tomato-based ketchups in Amish kitchens and homes were a lot similar to Heinz-style ones, but they had a far richer taste, whereas green tomato ketchups were just a Tangier version of that. Then you had apple ketchups, which were a lot more sweeter but still ever so slightly spicy, and you also had beet ketchups, which not only had this earthy aftertaste to them, but the prettiest deep red hue too. Amish families have been making ketchup since your grandfather first started to learn walking, and they've been preserving these for just as long too. Large batches of homemade Amish ketchup was a big thing during the tail end of summer and the onset of winter, and it was something that Amish people prided themselves on. They really wanted to avoid store-bought convenience products as much as they could, believing that traditional food was a lot more purer. It was heavily seasoned, and it definitely made a considerably better dip than your normal Heinz bottle ever could hope to. Dried beef was sometimes known as chipped beef, but it actually involved a lot of practices and preservation techniques that have been traditionally passed down through several generations across many regions of America. Basically, stuff like salt curing, air drying, and the like. The Amish are probably not the only ones who have dabbled in dried beef production, especially with how many families in the South and Midwest used to live off of techniques like this. Salting and curing fresh cuts of beef was something that was common knowledge to you by 12 and a part of your daily routine by 15, and the classic Amish military dish was usually creamed chipped beef on a toast. The soldiers in the military had some pretty colorful remarks about this dish because apparently it looks like someone took a dunk on some toast, if that still stirs up your appetite. A less visually distracting version of this dish is the casserole variant, which never was too popular in Amish communities but was definitely still something they whipped out on special occasions, especially those who were living in urban areas like New York and Detroit. See, for Amish people and Amish communities, there was honestly nothing more important than tradition and preserving it, and one of the most long-held traditions in their way of life was raising their own hogs for slaughter. Canning that sausage was a way to preserve the fresh hog meat without letting it spoil or without requiring a freezer. It was made with basically rendered lard so that it would last longer too, and it had more than a few uses. It was usually formed into patties, and Amish people would make the sandwiches or burgers out of it, or they would cover it with really hot lard or sausage drippings so that a seal was made. You could make a pretty typical American breakfast of eggs, potatoes, and sausages with this, or you could make sausage gravy as a nice little dip for your biscuits. It also worked phenomenally well with casseroles and stews as a flavor enhancer, and most Amish families often kept the seasonings for this pretty light. It wasn't store-bought sausage, which is typically not even half as seasoned or flavored as this. People would throw in sage, red pepper, chili flakes, and black pepper or cumin for a bolder taste, and some people would also throw in nutmeg and cloves of garlic for a stronger, more familiar scent. It was a way for them to have a really quick and easy meal available, since a lot of the rest of the stuff on the list so far, well, I won't say it takes a lot of work, but it's definitely not something you can expect to be eating at 15 either. See, Amish families extended their preservation and canning techniques onto not just their meats and fruits, but also their dairy. Canned milk, and that includes both sweetened condensed milk and evaporated milk, was something that was frequently used and a common sight in most Amish households. It was stored really well and didn't require any kind of refrigeration, and it was very, very good for baking, cooking, and even just drinking. It's a key ingredient in almost every famous Amish dessert you've heard of. Even Shoofly pie, the one we just talked about on this list, we talked about the filling, but they used canned milk in that too. They would use evaporated milk so that you would get a much richer filling, and custards and puddings were made with sweetened condensed milk. Amish people also made their own homemade ice cream, which sometimes also used evaporated milk. But the idea behind this was that since most Amish families didn't have access to fresh dairy, they would need sustainable and preservable options. They would use evaporated milk because it's pretty much just fresh milk with about 60% of the water removed and is a very shelf-stable product. It's also stupidly easy to make, and it works really well with caramel candies if you never knew that. Homemade horseradish sauce has been a scent that's familiarized itself with so many Amish kitchens across so many different generations that it seems like an understatement to call this a cultural classic for them. It's something that they hold dearly, whether for its help with sinus issues or its ability to make any kind of meat, cheese, or sandwich stand out that much more. Unlike what you would usually get for yourself at a store, Amish horseradish sauce is just as elaborate, extravagant, and strong as their homemade ketchup. Freshly grated horseradish root would be used along with vinegar and salt, plus some sugar and sour cream or mayonnaise, so that you could essentially get a top-tier horseradish sauce. That's not freshness you could ever buy for yourself at a store, and Amish families would also grate all of it by hand instead of using a food grinder. This basically releases a lot of strong fumes, and before you panic, those fumes are good for you. They make your eyes water and they help clear out your sinuses, so the next time that nose is blocked harder than your ex is, grab some horseradish. You might be glad you heard about a friendly little video on the Silly Little Video app. Amish people would use horseradish sauce as a condiment for a lot of things, but it was really just one of the best dips you could ever find, and it was a big reason why people started making their own dips in general. Chokecherry jelly was a really beloved Amish preservative that was made from wild chokecherries, which are just these small, deep red berries that grow in trees in tight groups. They were foraged in the summer, along the fence lines and areas with heavy forestation all throughout August to September. They were also really good with pectin, and if you don't know, pectin is something that you really need to make jelly. Amish families would enjoy making spreads, jams, and jellies out of these, and they were one of the most popular Amish traditions. People thought chokecherry jelly could soothe sore throats or coughs. It had high antioxidant content too, and it was something you'd always see in Amish markets and farm stands. Also, you could never really spend Christmas at an Amish home without this. As goofy as this name sounds, and please bear with me because I really can't say spork and speef without chuckling, it was actually a legit idea for an afternoon lunch. Before that though, let's get into what it is. Spork is basically just canned processed pork, and beef is exactly the same. But beef? I want whoever named these to win some kind of award. I'm not even sure if there's a category for best product names out there, but if there is, this guy should win. Luckily for this, the name wasn't the only thing it had going for it. It was really a lot like Spam, and it was affordable, easy to take around with you in your bag, and even easier to prepare since it was all pre-made. We're going to go into it in detail later, but this was really similar in texture and taste to Spam, just minus the tropical elements. It was a shelf staple. If you had a can of this and 2 slices of bread, you could pretty much make a sandwich today. See all those 10-step sandwich recipes on TikTok that ask you to go get a giant loaf of bread? Out with that, in with this. Bring back convenient sandwich making. Plus, speef and Spork were really good because they were so versatile. It was even a competitor to Spam because you could pretty much pair this with any classic breakfast or dish that was typical for Americans and get to eating. It was a great way to liven up some meals that were otherwise good but had gotten pretty monotonous thanks to being such regular mainstays at American tables. Speef was definitely the better option for families though, since it was a mix of beef and pork sometimes as well. You could make some banger casseroles off of this. Ropa vieja is a nostalgic dish, though it doesn't have the same long-standing popularity in America. If you go to Spanish communities here, you'll definitely find a similar sentiment in people's hearts, but you'll also find some of the most eye-popping plates of food you'll ever see. Don't even get me started on the tastes, because this takes the basics of Cajun cooking and makes it as explosive as we know Spanish cooking to be in terms of flavor. Cuban immigrants are again who we can thank for introducing this to us in the first place, since they were the ones that made Spanish cuisine pop off in Florida and its cooking scene. It's a comfort food of the decade, definitely. And the most popular one for Ropa vieja was arguably the 1970s. That's because it was never again as accessible as it was back then when people got the slow cooker. They were excited to try out all these dishes that previously they just didn't have access to. It's kind of like when you get a new car and you just can't wait to take it for a test run. Cuban-American households were already using this dish heavily, but Ropa vieja meant that now, the broader Caucasian audience could finally bask in a masterclass of flavors, spices, and seasonings too, after so long. Molasses is not the first thing that comes to mind when people think of sweeteners, but if you opened Grandma's pantry door, you'd see this thick and gooey liquid ready to enhance the taste of everything she baked. Cane sugar has to take back its seat because molasses adds a unique flavor to almost any dish. It doesn't look like much or anything special, yet it contains numerous nutrients and adds a burst of flavor. Getting its source from sugarcane or sugar beets, molasses can be compared to the sweetener's grandmaster, the sweetness of which can be mediocre to robust. Well, did you know that molasses is derived in the process of sugar manufacturing? It's like the bonus prize that no one knew they needed. Now for some more interesting facts about molasses. It is packed with nutrients, rich in vitamins and minerals such as iron, calcium, and potassium, among others. This sticky sweetener is perhaps one of the most versatile you will come across. You can use it in cookies, marinades, barbecue sauces, and even as a sweetener for baked beans. Stored properly, molasses can last for years, just like those hidden Christmas cookies from last year's batch. Before I get into why it died down, first, I need to talk about what a Hamburger helper even is. This was a packaged convenience food product that General Mills came up with in 1971, and it was a big part of their whole Betty Crocker shtick. The idea was to make something out of a pound of ground beef, and despite the name, there's no hamburger ingredients besides the beef. You had a box with dried pasta, rice, and a seasoning mix. It actually became a big thing in the 70s because it became a symbol of processed food and was one of the most popular packaged products in the nation. On the other hand, it is definitely something I would say is entirely nostalgia-driven now. Hamburger helpers are still available, and they're a convenient meal to go for. Don't get me wrong, but the days of its trends are dead in the water and in the past now. People would go out in droves to get a fix of a hamburger helper back in the 70s, and this was a very much socially expected thing to do, by the way. Like, you know how your friends call you for a round of Chipotle and gossip? That was pretty much the idea back then, too. The things that did this bad boy in are movements like the health-conscious trends that were constantly spreading over America. Lots of people were in favor of healthier, smaller, and leaner meals made using canned food, and their argument was that the national rise of fast food, fusion food, and street food was really just doing a number on everyone's guts. On the other hand, convenience culture really has outpaced dishes like these in longevity, at least. For reasons like these, it's hard to find a good hamburger helper, and even harder still to find someone who still swears by them. Throughout the Depression, the war, and every little bit of chaos after, canned bread was a constant friend, ally, and supporter of the American people. This dense, sweet, and spongy bread used to get that way thanks to a neat little trick known as steaming before canning, which really helped it retain that airy, sponge-like texture. This was used in war for soldiers as a part of government rations, and even organizations like the Red Cross would have it during many of their food drives. For just 20 or 25 cents, you could get some pretty decent bread, and the entire idea of this was to market how practical and convenient it is. I gotta say, it worked because people bought it in droves. Seriously, go ask your mom and dad about how much people used to get canned bread back in the day and how it was used for rations. They pretty much paired it with things like Campbell's soup or used it as a side for other dishes that involved bread. Not everybody even had an oven back then, and in an era with an increasing focus on hustling and grinding your way into a nice little retirement, the appeal of baking bread from scratch for a few hours wasn't really something people were too into. Cowboy stew is a really romantic dish. It's something right out of the actual American West, and cowboys did genuinely make this dish so much they forever stuck the label onto it too. What is it? It's a stew. A cowboy stew. What does that really mean, though? Well, as is pretty characteristic of cowboys and their lifestyle, it means going with the flow and using whatever you have next to you to the best of your ability. Cowboy stew wasn't something that only cowboys ate back then, though. It was a substantial meal even for churches. Know why? Because it took almost nothing to make it, and the dish had this rustic, make-do charm to it that really put you in what the kids today would call the grind set. Why would a dish do that? Picture yourself in their shoes. You're a middle-class worker in the 1960s, and things are getting rough with money again. It's not like financial security is a year-round, 24/7 concept, right? You use what you can because tomorrow you know you have to go back to work. You get a bare-bones stew that pulls together some respectable flavor for the amount of ingredients and the quality it's working with, and it kind of brightens your day, puts some energy back into you, and lets you go tackle on another shift. It caught on, really. Canned vegetables were the silent workers of Granny's kitchen. Those beautiful inventions offered the hint of a summer in Granny's pantry, although it was buried in snow. Think for a moment that you entered her kitchen and saw those shiny jars standing as soldiers, always giving you the taste of comfort in your mouth. Canning the vegetables wasn't just about preserving the harvest. It was, to a certain extent, a survival technique in a world where a grocery store was not a day's ride away. For the green beans or the tomatoes, for instance, Grandma would always ensure that she picked the freshest from her farm and prepared them in the most appropriate way. If they are your favorite vegetables or fruits, it's like preserving them in time. If you close the lid well, you are going to be eating the produce of the summer, even in winter. Did you know that the art of canning dates back to the early 19th century? It was developed as a means through which people could acquire food during wartime. Boy, that operation was something like a military strategy. And now, we can enjoy that same convenience in our homes. Canned veggies are perfect for making soups, casseroles, and even as a side dish. No cooking required. Simply heat the meal and you're set to start your delicious eating spree. Let's head on over to how people did things in the winter. A recipe that is largely forgotten right now but still made some noise back when it was really popular in the 20th century is shrimp and grits. The secret to an incredible plate of these was all in the milk, butter, and cheddar cheese. Depending on the quality and how you handled it, you would ever have shrimp that had not really absorbed the flavor or the best seafood experience you could hope to have at home. Luckily, over many long years, the home cooks of our nation perfected the recipe and kept passing it down, one generation to the next. Some chopped bacon for a smoky flavor, or sausage drippings were also really popular picks for older chefs to run with. Grits would be made with dent corn and often boiled, then mixed with the butter and milk. How did your family make these if they ever did? Stone soup is almost exactly what it sounds like, and it does involve a solid rock being in your soup. But hear us out, it is only temporary. Now, the origin of this term dates back to a European folktale about how two people would come into a town, convince everyone to share a bit of food, and then make a meal for the entire town. Sharing is caring, right? Anyway, the actual technique concerning food is to heat a rock in a fire and then place it in a bowl of soup so that it can cook it. People would add meat trimmings and scraps, plus carrots and cabbage to the soup to give it more nutritional value as well as flavor, and it did more or less work. What the real magic was that it browned the soup, which is something that you could not get in most standard soups people prepared. It also added a much richer flavor overall that was to die for, and people started to adopt the technique as it made soup on a budget much better than normal. Golden syrup is this really thick sugar syrup that is pretty accurately named because, wow, this thing has a vibrantly strong amber hue. That kind of fits the taste of the syrup too. When I see amber-colored things, especially sweet ones, my mind goes straight to caramel. Does that happen for you too? We'd both be right though, since the syrup was caramel-flavored. It also had a sweetener that really sealed the whole deal together, wrapped in a neat little bow. You could use this for so many things, like making your porridge a bit more lively with this, adding it to desserts for some extra oomph, or using it as a drizzle over buttermilk pancakes. The possibilities covered breakfast, lunch, and dinner, so you can see why every boomer's home had this in their pantry. A lot of easy and no-fuss baking recipes like flapjacks and tarts were pretty much reliant on this syrup, and for good reason too. This thing really tasted amazing. As a country, we can thank Texas for a lot of things. Tex-Mex cuisine, an infinite supply of memes thanks to country music, rodeos, some of the nicest BBQ sauces you'll ever have, and a guaranteed chuckle every time you have to speak to a redneck Republican. If you want to keep adding to the list, a good chili con carne is something that'll make you even more thankful the state exists and has developed into the savory jackpot it is. The dish pretty much means chili with meat, and it's a wonderful blend of beef, chilies, and spices with roots in the Mexican borderlands. It's somewhat become a symbol of Texas cooking too, which is known for not being easy on your stomach at all. This dish is no different because it takes cubed beef, chili peppers, and beans, plus some canned tomatoes, and puts them in a slow cooker. The one-pot way of cooking it was kind of considered a massive game changer because, while yes, you could just leave it to cook now, it meant that you didn't have to stir the chili constantly. The thing with chili con carne is that unless you did that stirring, you really wouldn't get the same bang for your buck. Inexpensive, popular in chili parlors, and very good with a cold beer, it doesn't take rocket science to figure out how this dish has all the elements it needs to succeed in middle-class Texas. As far as the chili craze goes, when America did go through phases of wanting spicier food, a lot of states besides Texas would go back to this southern classic. Some say this dish is also a Native American classic because if you go to the Southwest, you'll find remnants of old tribes, like the Pueblo, who still make variants of this dish. Theirs are even more traditional, with the recipes largely unchanged since pre-colonial European times. Chili con carne is a wonderful melting pot of indigenous, Mexican, and Spanish that takes full advantage of the different backgrounds that are present in American cooking. Salted pork, also known as the original meat preservation recipe, is the true most valuable player of Grandma's kitchen. Before anyone stares in the refrigerator, people rely on salt to maintain the freshness of their meat, or at least keep it edible. Imagine a time when all that stood between you and rotting meat was a hearty layer of salt. Grandma knew this secret well. She took a good piece of pork and mixed it with salt, and voila! Salted pork was born. The exciting thing about this method is that the salt draws out moisture. This makes bacteria almost unable to grow. It's like having a tiny bouncer at your meat party, ensuring that no unwanted germs spoil the celebration. Salted pork could be thrown into a pot of beans, added to a hearty stew, or simply fried up for breakfast. The options are endless, and Grandma knew them all. In addition, salted pork is a staple food during difficult times. It supported the family when fresh meat was in short supply. As an added bonus, it's versatile and will last for months. perfect for the long winter months or if you're traveling around the country. Although modern health trends warn against excessive sodium intake, in your grandmother's time, a pinch of salt was the only way to survive. So next time you're eating bacon or ham, think of your grandmother's salted pork heirloom. It is not just a relic from the past, but a delicious reminder of how creativity can lead to delicious solutions. Speaking of how different things were in their time due to the economical strife, one thing that got really popular back when your grandparents were still young was sausage gravy and biscuits. This might seem like an outlandish combo to us today, and we admit it takes a bit of getting used to, but the magic is all in the gravy. Biscuits and gravy are already something Americans have been pretty accustomed to eating, especially in the 20th century, but innovation is one of the finer points of the country, and culinary matters are no exception. People eventually found out that using pork sausage crumbles enriched the gravy and made it irresistible, especially if they were smoked. Usually biscuits like jumbo buttermilk ones make for a great side to the dish, but even the gravy alone was worth eating on its own. Speaking of casserole, this one's a mouthful to say, but trust me, it's worth the effort. Neo-Life. Nest dehydrated stroganoff casserole was this pre-made mix that just needed water added to it so you could get rid of that icky dehydration part of the whole deal. I get why they did it because canned food that can't last is like a fish that can't swim. Kind of redundant, so it's all right. Plus, this thing always gets a pass for how close it actually came to imitating the flavor of a real casserole made from scratch. You had a creamy, beefy stroganoff cassie, which you could obviously tell is processed, but for what it was worth, which was just $1 or $2, and the amount of value you got out of it, nobody was complaining about a little bit of a powdery aftertaste. Stroganoff is definitely something that was more popular in their time, though. Have you eaten much of it? Or is it something you regularly get a plate of? Arroz con pollo is a treasured dish rooted in Spanish culture, delighting taste buds and gracing dinner tables for countless generations. More than just a meal, arroz con pollo brings warmth, comfort, and nostalgia with every bite. It embodies the simple pleasures that food can bring, comfort found not in someone's shoulder or at the bottom of a bottle, but in something as humble as rice. When topped with tender, perfectly seasoned chicken, this dish has a way of grounding you, reminding you of life's small, genuine joys. It's for those who find solace in food, in the gathering of loved ones, and in flavors that speak of tradition. Arroz con pollo is an invitation to relax, indulge, and reconnect. If that resonates, then this dish was always meant for you, promising satisfaction, warmth, and the perfect blend of flavor in every bite. Cities like Miami and New York were some of the first places where Caribbean culture touched down and made a name for itself. In terms of the middle class, it was a pretty economic and practical dish. You had all your health-related needs covered, and it didn't cost much at all, with an entire family meal costing maybe $4 or $5. Even less, actually, since one of the key highlights of this dish was its ability to turn a bit of chicken into a show stealer. A lot of dishes make ample use of protein and meat, but they often don't optimize each lb of beef or chicken in there, so you get a lot of bites that feel extra gamey or chewy and don't have enough flavor. That's not something you have to worry about with arroz con pollo, and that's why it's still a pretty popular dish even today, especially now that slow cookers are in an entirely different league than what they used to be when they were first introduced to the general public. Hardtack, the last biscuit standing. Let's be honest, hardtack isn't anyone's idea of comfort food, but don't underestimate this resilient little biscuit. It's the culinary Swiss Army knife. Made to last, hardtack has been an emergency food staple for centuries, and if you peeked into Grandma's pantry, you might still find a few of these unbreakable snacks lurking. Designed for sailors, soldiers, and anyone needing long-lasting nourishment, hardtack keeps it simple with just flour, water, and salt. It may sound basic, but that's the secret to its survival power. It can last for years. In fact, some hardtack has even been pulled from shipwrecks, still rock hard and technically edible. Now that is longevity. Though not exactly soft or flavorful, hardtack has been a literal lifesaver. It's tough enough to be gnawed on as is, softened in coffee, or crumbled into soup. Just don't expect a gourmet experience. It's about as exciting as chewing on a brick. But for Grandma, this was essential, a way to get carbs when nothing fresh was around. So, while today's diets lean towards fresh and flavorful, there's something endearing about a food that stood the test of time. Egg drop soup sounds a little fancier than it is, but have you never had a simple dish that knocked the socks off of you? Just a 2 or 3 ingredient show that really hit home, ticked every box, and left you with a smile? Egg drop soup was a lot like that. It was just diced potatoes and onions, which might get you thinking of the pie we just went over, but this is more like a broth. If chicken broth was there, then of course that was the foundation, but water worked too. Once the potatoes started cooking, you would drizzle some scrambled eggs before adding whole ones. It might look lumpy and score a little less for presentation, but it deserves a solid A+ just for the taste alone, especially if you would pair it with some leftover bread. Mixed vegetables were pretty much what they sound like. You had the usual gang of peas, green beans, corn, carrots, corn, some celery, and corn again. Did I emphasize that they really liked their corn? I hope I did. Anyway, for just about 15 cents, all the nutrition in the world was at your fingertips, and it was a massively good way to plan your meals and save money at the same time. You could use this as a standby meal, put it in a pot pie, use it for casseroles and side dishes, or whatever else. Stir-fry them and serve it up with rice or eat it with some chili. The world is your oyster. Or your carrot? Anyway, you could do a lot here. Also, it was a really convenient way for grandmas and home chefs to sneak in some greens in their kids' foods without them realizing it. Can't walk up into the kitchen and say, "Mom, no carrots," if she pulls a fast one on you and sneaks ready-made vegetables from a can, huh? Let's go on over to Creole cuisine. Want to know a hot spot for that kind of cooking back in the 1970s? It was shrimp Creole, which had hints of several other styles of cooking. You could have something with French, Spanish, and African influences all in one bite. That's a pretty vast variety of flavors, so let's break down what shrimp Creole had out of all of that. You have your basics like bell peppers, onions, and celery, but it also had canned tomatoes for a no-fuss sauce that really soaked in all of the aromatics and gave the shrimp a pretty unique flair. You could make this dish for around $2.80 back then, because per lb of shrimp usually cost you around $1.50 or $2 back then. That's a pretty bare minimum price, but let's say you were cooking for a family of 4. You would have been good in, like, $10 or $15 maximum. The whole mix of onions, celery, and peppers was actually considered a trinity in Cajun and Creole cooking. Shrimp Creole also made a lot of use of thyme, parsley, okra, and garlic as well, so you could really mix and match and see what worked best for you. Not everyone liked the traditional versions of the dish, and I can't blame them because it's meant for people who grew up having a completely different palate than ours. All the same, this dish, which is traditionally served over rice, was considered one of the greatest hits of the cuisine. Cajun and Creole in general had found a pretty nice home for themselves in places like New Orleans and Louisiana. Restaurants like Antoine's and Tujag's in the 19th century were establishing a solid Creole cooking scene, and by the 20th century, cookbooks had already featured shrimp Creole as a solid dish you could rely on whenever you needed more seafood in your diet. Oatmeal remains to be the uncontested breakfast winner when it comes to the Grandma's Pantry breakfast rating of the most filling for breakfast until lunch. When it comes to healthy breakfast choices, oatmeal is definitely a win-win, providing a filling and warm experience. Forget the novelty of breakfast bowls. Grandma knew a steaming bowl of oats could power you up for any endeavor, whether it was a hard day at the office or an all-out snowball fight in the backyard. Loaded with fiber and important nutrients that the body requires, oatmeal has the marvelous effect of making anyone full longer than a bowl of cereal sweetened with sugar. You can dress it up with fruits, nuts, honey, or even a splash of maple syrup. Feeling adventurous? Add a spoonful of peanut butter and some chocolate chips, and you've turned breakfast into a treat that feels like dessert. What's even better? Oatmeal is a long-term product, and that is why it is an ideal product for a pantry, for emergencies, and for lazy Sundays. Historically, oatmeal has been around for thousands of years, but Grandma had her own secret: the perfect cooking time. Vegetarian chili definitely had its heyday in the same time as those moments I was talking about. Listen, when I say movement, I don't mean a 3-day bandwagon full of peaceful sit-ins and protests like we have today. I mean, like nationally, parents everywhere were livid. They couldn't stand that their kids were actually preferring to stay inside with a McDonald's Happy Meal and the television screen, and lots of them became super proactive about their family's diet and eating habits because of the massive revamp in culture. I mean, in this same century, these people went from surviving off of foraging wild mushrooms to watching moving pictures on a screen, having a magic box that just cools all their food full-time, slow cookers, the internet, computers, and God knows what else. All this to say, it was a fast-paced era, and people reacted with what they knew worked: vegetables. If the Depression proved anything, it was that there was a massive problem with people's diets. It wasn't economical, and it definitely wasn't healthy, and the alternative wasn't as impossible to switch to as most people would have you believe. Circumstances like this saw the rise of vegetarian chili and vegan cookbooks, but unfortunately, it couldn't make the cut, especially in the South, where people just outright rejected it. Now this one's really going to blow your mind. Imagine a world where you can get Monarch Alaska King crab for just 50 cents, or max $1. See, that's my kind of capitalism. These days you go out on a date, and the idea of either of you ordering the crab really sets your finances back for the remainder of the week. Back then, it was literally in abundance. I mean, you couldn't go a day without your friendly neighborhood fisherman catching a fat, juicy crab that was just begging to be boiled. Of course, that meant that canned crab was an idea that wasn't too far down the pipeline. It was made to preserve the sweetness we've come to love crab for, and it was used in all kinds of dishes. Crab casseroles, salads, as a dip, or even crab sandwiches. The options were pretty broad. I gotta say, it must have been easy to keep in shape when all the protein you could ever want is that easy to get. How about you? Think king crab something you'd fill your cabinets up with if you were born back in our parents' days? Real quick, fish chowder, on the other hand, is definitely a New England classic. It has its roots in 18th century culture, which was heavily dominated by stews, and they used to whip up a storm in the kitchen trying all kinds of crazy, wacky, wahoo fish combinations Americans wouldn't even dream of. It was all affordable too, since a lot of cooking in both America and the United Kingdom was aimed at the common man back then. You know, before a quarter-piece fried chicken meal costs like as much as a date for 2 people. Anyway, in coastal cities in America, fish chowder popped off for obvious reasons. You had your catches of the day, and you had a dish that could more or less work with any of them. Plus, it's not like any fishing-heavy spot was lacking cod of haddock, which is pretty much what was used all the time for fish chowder. It wasn't as beloved before one-pot culture as it was after, and that's because if you really wanted to let the fish soak in the flavor, you'd have to pay a lot of attention to detail for a long while. Thanks to slow cooking, you could get a rich and creamy soup almost every time. Homemade pickles. No self-respecting grandma would let a crop of cucumbers go to waste. Enter homemade pickles. Pickles aren't just a way to add zing to a sandwich. They are a way to maintain all of the garden's hard work. When the cucumbers roll up too fast for you to eat, you pickle them, and it's so easy. But pickles aren't just limited to cucumbers, carrots, onions, even nuts can be salted. Ready to be a delicious and crunchy side dish in almost any meal. Pickles have a fun history too. It dates back thousands of years to ancient Mesopotamia. But in Grandma's time, it was all about jars and secret salt recipes passed down from generation to generation. Some pickles are sweet, some types have a sour taste, and some packed a punch that would bring tears to your eyes. It is a science and an art, and Grandma has perfected the pickling process. The best part? Pickles will last forever. Okay? Maybe not forever, but it's close enough. If stored properly, it can be stored for months or even years, ready to add deliciousness to any meal. Speaking of molasses, they also went really great with some slow-baked beans. Molasses have a knack for adding a lot of deep flavor to a dish, and the fact that these were usually left overnight to absorb all of it made for probably the best baked beans people could get in those times. It was especially popular as a summertime meal. Baked beans were not too hard to get, not the tinned versions because those were still pricey. Once you had some, you would just leave them in water to soften, and then the beans would be baked for 8 hours straight overnight. Making it was a whole day, literally. But once you were done with the prep work, it was all just a waiting game, and this was one time where being patient really paid off. Now, how is that for a round of some forgotten Amish stockpile foods? Let us know which stood out to you the most in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe.